In conclusion, in this presentation, I have discussed how The Gift in Wartime by Tran Mong Tu and When You Go Away by W.S. Merwin. I discussed how they compare, and I discussed how they are different. I also talked about how they represent postmodernism with their disillusionment, strong imagery, and their talk about the Vietnam War. And that is their theme. Their theme was to protest against the war and discuss this loss. So I also answered the objective questions, and for the ones that related back to my stories, I, talked about how they related back to the poems that I read. And then I talked about how the writer's life affected their writing. For the similarities, I talked about how they both had to do with death and losing somebody that you love, how they were both talking about Vietnam War and the intense pain of losing someone. I talked about their feeling, their imagery, and how they were both in free verse. For differences, I discussed how When You Go Away resolves itself differently than The Gift in Wartime. The Gift in Wartime has this resolve, but When You Go Away does not. I talked about the organizations. They're both in free verse, but one has these stanzas. The Gift in Wartime has stanzas rather than just floating free verse. I talked about how the postmodernists, how they represent postmodernism. And the objective questions I went over was, how does religion fit into postmodernism? I talked about how they did not talk about religion in my stories, but religion can be the hero or the demon. I talked about how figurative language and form is used. For the symbolism, metaphors, imagery, those are the things that, the forms and figurative languages that were used. I talked about how nature gets addressed, how it can be destruction or unification. I went over human nature and postmodernism and how both of these poems had to do with psychology, which was how human nature was addressed in postmodernism. Government and society, I talked about how there was a lot of corruption in government and how society had these expected social rules, but they felt like they could break them if they weren't fair. Talked about the American dream was to be happy in postmodernism era, and I talked about characteristics of the hero, which was doing good things but for the wrong reasons, and that anti-hero that some of the postmodernism works had. And then I talked about how literature changed throughout time, because we change over time. And then, so I discussed also how the writers' lives affected their writing, how Tran Mong Tu was involved in the Associated Press and was stationed in Saigon, which is the capital of North Vietnam, and how that affected his writing. And I talked about how W.S. Merwin had this blockage and change in his writing style to protesting against social ills and war. So, in conclusion, Tran Mong Tu's writing and W.S. Merwin's writing highly influenced the war and how people viewed it. It kind of gave people in the postmodernist era that feeling that they weren't alone in their grief. Lots of people were grieving over what had happened in the war. They were grieving for the loss of their loved ones. So many people had lost the people that they loved in the war. And I really think that these two poems really hit home on, why have we done this? Why have we put ourselves through this war? War only leads to this. All it leads is to loss and to death and to mourning. So these poems really were just kind of like a wrap-up, like, is this really what we want out of our lives, is to fight these wars and then have nothing but loss when we get back? Lots of people could relate to these stories. I believe that they wrote them so that they could contact their readers and say, you're not alone in this. We agree with you. We agree that what happened is wrong. We should not have fought this war. War only leads to death. And that is how I believe that these stories have helped society and helped better the time period and why they were written in the first place. So thanks for watching, and I hope that you learned a lot, and I hope that you learned about postmodernism and what I went over.